staid audiences who sort of, do that and all that, yeah. And this is Nishant Saldanha, who's an amazing talent whom we don't know that much about. Most of us here who've known comics in India know Priya's work very well. But his work is a revelation, and I'm sure you'll agree with me when you see it. So what we'll do is, given that they're both illustrators, we'll start with presentations of their work. I think we should see what their work is, and then we can chat. So we'll start with Nishant, who will take it away here. Nishant, tell them a little bit about yourself, and then you can, she'll help you with the presentation. We can just cycle through your slides, and you can talk while you're doing that. All right?
Hi, everyone. So what I sent Annie for this presentation were just mostly, I think, comics from a single title that I have called Mr. Good Guy. And that's him sitting on that cloud with that big crow. And a little bit about me. I'm actually trained as an animator and a filmmaker. But I started making comics, I think similar to Priya. And so the kind of comics I make are just single panels usually. Sometimes there's no words at all, so they could come across as illustration, but I don't know if I see it that way. And they all fit together possibly in one kind of a world. But so it's hard to describe because I think of them as kind of surreal works which allows people to enter it in any way that they want. So it wouldn't make sense for me to say this is what's happening here. So maybe we could flip through a few slides or one by one and I'll see what happens. Okay, so the first one, if there's 4 of them, then this is kind of a series. So the first one is, you see him sitting on a crow, and then on a cloud, and then the next, they've swapped places, and the cloud is sitting with him. And in the next slide, if it's there, they're sort of all just falling through the sky. And Mr. Good Guy says, "It was great having breakfast with you and your wife." And the cloud says, "Thanks." And I think that's it. There might be another one at the end. Oh yeah, and this was like a bonus slide. It says, or comic, it says, Mr. Good Guy is now like some kind of a dinosaur creature, and he's giving them all a ride home, and he says, "I'll take you home now." And there's a little caption that says, "The clouds are shining, not a single sun in the sky." So yeah, those were a set. This one, if you've noticed, Mr. Good Guy changes shape and form. You always kind of know it's him. And you'll soon get to know that he's not particularly good. He's kind of morally ambiguous, confused character. This is an image which I like. I titled this Moon Infestation. And that's him in his home. And the doormat says, "Not welcome." The next slide. I find this one interesting because I just made a kind of like Henry Rousseau-inspired drawing of him just being annoyed at rain happening. And you can see he's very tall here and kind of over the trees, and he's getting wet. But a number of people, because I don't title my comics or necessarily name them, like when I sell them at conventions, people come up to me and they describe what they see, and as a way to say, "Oh, I like that one," or "I want to buy that one," as a single print or a postcard. And a number of people described this one as that existential one, which I thought was quite interesting because I had never done that or thought of it that way when I was making it. And so that's what I enjoy, actually, is the way people enter into the work and the many different ways in which they can do that. I think like it makes it richer for me, and so I feel like connected to the audience or to the readers. This was part of that Henry Rousseau theme that I was doing, and this is like based off the famous painting, The Sleeping Gypsy, where the lion is about to eat him, I guess, in this picture. And he says, "I'm sorry," and Mr. Good Guy says, "It's okay." Um, this was like, I was in America, I studied and worked there for a bit, and it was during, in Los Angeles, and it was during that whole beginning of the Trump time, and everyone was afraid of like bombs coming from North Korea during that like scare. And so like, I felt this was kind of real, where you can see him very upset at something happening on the news, but he says, "Thank God I don't live there." And he's crying. I don't know if we're good on time. Okay. So yeah, we can just flip through the rest, I think. Here, he's having dinner with a tiger whose coat he has borrowed, and he says, "Thanks for the coat." And the two tails are like, one tail says to the skin, like, "I miss you." Next, please. We can maybe move to the next one. This one just says, "Happy birthday to me." And he's like made some kind of a birthday cake out of spiders, it seems. And even the cake is running away, stealing his tears. And the candle is quite sad as well. Next one, please. Here he's with a soup and a grapevine. I mean, a tomato vine and a grapevine, and the tomato says, "May I have some wine?" And he just says, "No sharing, please." So yeah, he's always like, I feel like there's many versions of the same comic where he's having dinner with with two guests, and he just finds a way to mess it up. Like, he's trying to be hospitable and welcoming, but he ends up being extremely destructive or offensive. Yeah. So similarly, we could probably skip a bit quicker. Yeah. This one just says "pop," and he missed. He popped himself, not the balloon. So here it says, "Ophelia, why are you crying? I plucked every single star in the sky for you." And I think I don't title them, like I said, but in my head, I think I would have titled this, "Even the best intentions can lead to cosmic disaster," or something like that. Yeah, I'm happy to be done.
So, when you look at his work, and which I did recently, startlingly insightful. When you look at it, you really get sort of, sorry?
Are we seeing?
Yes, we will. We get to, you really need to start, you really start thinking about this kind of stuff he's writing about, and it's very interesting. Priya, we'll move on to your stuff. Our helper seems to be deserting us. No, we have one more presentation coming up. Sorry, it seems to be a little slow. Yeah, why don't you do that? Here we go.
So incidentally, my first comic was with Aniruddha and Salil. So there was this organization called Toxic Links. And Annie and Salil were writing about, so they had a lot of information about sustainability, toxins in the environment, about the air in different parts of the country, and all this data needed to be put together very interestingly, and Annie and Salil were kind of doing that, and it was their idea to kind of do it in the form of comics. So they sort of got in touch with me, and we worked on this together. And it was like a black and white comic. I don't remember how many pages it was now, but yeah, roughly that one. And at this point, I had no idea what comics were. Annie had read more comics than me, and that was the first time I was even sort of reading a lot of comics that he suggested I should. And it had a lot to do with sustainable building. Then again, toxins, about the way we consume products. So we did this. This was done in, I think, 2008, and then we solved the whole climate crisis with this. I moved on to kind of experimenting with a little more, working on other things. And sometime, I think about 4 or 5 years back, I had the guts to kind of write my own comic. I was working with other writers before this. And I worked on this anthology. It was an Indo-German anthology where we had to sort of, it came out of a workshop where there were about 8 German artists and 8 Indian artists who kind of stayed together at a residency in Nrityagram. It's in the outskirts of Bangalore. And I'd always wanted to tell the story of my maternal grandmother. She was a very interesting woman. She but like all good Malayalis, she went to the GALF in many years back, and she was a nurse. So those years of her life were like a big blank. The whole family didn't really know what exactly happened while she was there. She fell in love with my grandmother. They got married there. And my grandfather was this very larger-than-life personality. And everyone used to keep talking about him, about how great he was. But when it came to her, she was not a very expressive person, and there was very little information about her. And I think I myself had a not so, I expected a grandmother to be a much more loving person than she was, and because she wasn't expressive, I had these ideas about her. And at some point, when my grandfather passed away, and then she, about I think 10 years back, she got really ill, and when she got ill, she started talking about her life, and that was when I actually got to know what her life was actually about. And somehow I wanted to correct the narrative about her and really write about what she went through as a young woman, as somebody who had to come back and raise 5 children on her own in Kerala, because what we knew of our grandfather was also not completely true.
So where did this appear?
This appeared in this anthology of comics called Elephant in the Room. It was published by Zuban. Oh, this is okay.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah. So I contribute to a lot of, I do a lot of short comics on and off, and a lot of these comics somehow have to do with the intersection of sort of interaction between animal and human life, and a combination of sort of sociology and human emotion. So I heard this story I was in Wayanad at some point, and I heard this story about a grey hornbill who had lost its partner, and it was a slightly tragic story. At the same time, it could have been the story of a man and a woman. So I tried and there's this online comics forum called Brain Dead, and they were looking for comics they were celebrating Earth Hour, and so this was my contribution to that. I often contribute to a magazine called Indian Quarterly. They have some fantastic content, and I once made a silent comic called Disarmament. It was just about your reaction to something, when you see great beauty, your reaction to that. This one was for a French, it's a French publication called Le Courage. They wanted a contribution on, so they give out themes, and I think they bring out a magazine every quarterly, and the theme was about superior minorities. So I used the idea of the Kopi Luwak, the coffee, and it's basically civet coffee, and how narratives, false narratives sort of make something superior or inferior. so I sort of compared the idea of, like civet coffee and how its colonial past actually, and how these narratives are actually made to sell shit to us.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the interest of time, I'm going to go straight through
All
to
right.
Indira, and
course.
maybe you can. There's a lot of other work, but unfortunately, we are squeezed for time in these sessions.
Yeah, so it was Indira Gandhi's centenary year last year, and the editor of Kartika, she actually came up with the idea, Kartika VK of Amazon Context. She wanted to do, she said that, we must have a book out about Indira Gandhi for the millennials. Basically for those for a lot of kids who grew up in the 90s or even late 80s, perhaps they didn't know, about the first person who kind of messed around with our democracy. And also, we needed a biography that was that had to do with that, which contained things that millennials might relate to. So there were aspects of her life that we tried to kind of bring out. Like, I didn't know that she actually, suffered from, when she was a teenager, suffered from depression. Then we also kind of touched upon areas of, her life with, not her life with Feroz Gandhi, but, how she met him. Also, a large section was about the emergency, because that's something that probably that generation doesn't really, care or know about. So this was done as part comics and part prose. I collaborated with the author, Priya Roy, for this.
Right. Okay. So to end the visual part of the thing, I'm going to go across to one more image of Nishant's, and I'll tell you something about it, and he can also tell us some things about it. So Nishant's work, the Mr. Good Guy, has recently been selected for an anthology called The Best American Comics, right? That's what it's called. And besides the, how does one get out of here? No, I want to get to the previous folder. Under copy. Right. Okay. That, yeah. Okay, thanks. Nishant, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Nishant, the end papers aren't here, are they? No. They were? Oh, really? But, okay. Why don't you show them the book? Yeah. Okay, I'll switch this off in the meantime. Yeah. Okay, so this is the Best American Comics 2019 anthology, and Mr. Good Guy features in this, and Nishant was also asked to do the end papers. So let's hear a little bit about the comic as well as the end papers.
Yeah, so there's there's a single, one of the few multi-panel comics that I've done with Mr. Good Guy is the one they selected. And it shows him arranging, like making snowmen basically, and then saying to them, "Oh, it's freezing, isn't it?" And so he takes them all home and gives them tea and puts them in front of the fireplace, and they all melt. So it's just, so my work in this book is just this one comic, but they asked me to make the end papers for the book, and so I guess this was a chance for me to be more illustrative, but So what I suggested was I'd like drawing foliage, not a lot, but I was like in that space, I guess, as I've been doing that for a while. And so I did 2 drawings. So usually books generally have the same end paper on either end, but I did 2 like variations on the same type of image, which is a number of plants. Yeah, so a number of plants sitting around a dinner table, basically having a meal. And so the first one was, this was where I got to sneak in like my Indian and Goan heritage. And I did a version of The Last Supper, which nobody has really called out. And you see that all the plants are native flowers to Goa, while the Christ is a grapevine. And what they're eating is bread and wine, but it's undo pao and chili added with it. And I feel like this is less, I don't like this image as much. It's not 13 characters, so it's not The Last Supper, there's 15 of them. And these were plants from the entire North American continent, because I didn't know the plants very well from then, so I tried to be like very democratic, and I have that going on, and they're eating cranberries and blueberries. And you have like chilies from Mexico and various other things.
All right. So let's get on to a little bit of chat about stuff. So the thing is, though it doesn't overtly seem so, I found your work to be pretty political, because you're talking about issues and things which are right now very hot button issues. Do you see your work in the same light?
I think I do very much, but very few people seem to call that out or seem to tell me about it. But I think I make an image because they're just single images actually, and there's no long narrative that I have to construct and tweak. They usually like come into my head as like a strange image, and when it keeps appearing, like almost fully formed, I'm like, oh, okay, I have to draw that one. And it must be because of the stuff that I'm seeing around, stuff that's bothering me politically. And so, and I kind of know that that's there, but it's up to the people, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. You've also worked on many things that are, I'll give mine, go after, that are political. And it's intriguing because I think in India, a lot of the comics that have come out, the more serious comics, have been political in nature. What drives that kind of stuff in India?
Actually, any visual, anything visual that you create would have, is political in many ways. So even if it's a personal story, it is political. So the choice of, even I do a lot of children's picture books as well. So even in that, even the choice of, what you put in your image, it might be just like, the color of somebody's skin, or the difference between, two people, the height of, two people. Even that is you're making a political point even then. I think what is, especially in comics, one thing that, I noticed that it works in India is, first of all, not everyone understands comics. It's still a very new sort of a medium. And so it has, there's a way for it to kind of go under the radar and sort of reach people that you might want it to reach, the message. So, for example, I think, like Brain Dead, the online comics that forum that's been set up. So there's a lot of satire that you can use in comics. And satire it works best when both the parties think that it's not about them. Yeah. So I think comics has the ability to do that, use satire well. And also, like I said, I don't think too many people in India read comics. And those who want to kind of sort of read it, it is still a sort of small circle of people, a bit of an echo chamber. Yeah.
Like many places.
like many places.
So in fact, do you want to talk a little bit about the development of the indie comic scene in India? How things have changed, what's come in, some of the key players. Let's talk a little about that.
The indie comic scene of when I first started, it was mostly, I think there were a lot of anthologies which were coming out. I don't see as many, anthologies now as there were before. A lot of the anthologies. One thing I notice is there's of course more women doing.
You're going in and out? No, I think there is a problem.
Yeah, there are more women doing comics. If you remember the Power anthology, I think I spoke about this. If you look at the index, it is like heavily leaning towards men and Bengali men. So that has kind of changed a bit. There are lots of young. There's the Indie Comics Fest that's happening all over the country, and yeah.
I think that's also partly because some of the anthologies that have come out more recently have been edited by women,
Yes.
right? That I think has made a difference also in terms of the
Yeah,
representation. Yeah.
And what was I saying? The Indie Comics Fest has sprung up in different cities. So a lot of young college students have started making zines, and sort of. I don't think I was as confident about doing that at maybe 10 years back. But so it's quite encouraging to see young people kind of putting out their work for other in public spaces like this for people to kind of consume.
Thanks. Nishant, you moved back recently to Goa, I mean, relatively recently. And for those of you who are interested and not aware, Goa is going to have the second of its Indie Comics Fests on the 14th at the Marquinez Palace, the art gallery in the Marquinez Palace. A lot of independent creators of comics will be showing their work there. So if you're interested, please land up. They're very interesting young people doing good work here. And yeah, self-publishing, yeah, that's also there, yeah. And so do land up for that. You're missing this one,
Yeah.
but how do you compare the comics scene in the US? I mean, you don't know much about what's happened here right now. You'll get to know that, I'm sure. But what is the scene in the US? How do indie comics work there?
Like you were saying about self-publishing, I feel in the US, like with many things or many industries in the US, there's like the main industry for the art form or the craft, and as a reaction to that, there's the indie version. And what happens is, like with comics, it's going to be Marvel and all the superhero stuff that is mainstream, along with some good stuff. I mean, I don't mean that, but along with stuff like Calvin and Hobbes, where it's much more like autorial, like an author, there's one voice behind it. And what happens to a lot of the other people is, a lot of other comics artists, that they react to that, and so and they make work that is not published by a publishing house. And I think self-publishing, which is how I got into it, is much more well known there because of the frequency of comics fests and indie comics fests. And when you realize that you can self-publishing, particularly today or ever since the 90s or whenever, when the internet became very active, self-publishing doesn't even mean you make a zine. You can just make something and put it up. You have to wonder, are you going to earn money from this, or are you going to use it to then get bigger gigs? But it's a way to put your work out there in the way that you exactly want, and that gives rise to authors who want to hold on to their specific points of view. Like my comics would not have worked in a publishing format because when I make them, I don't choose an aspect ratio. And so everything is a different rectangle with different length and breadth. And so when I almost made a zine to force it into a physical form, and I had to put other pictures behind it and increase their border in order for them to all fit into the size of the book. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I find, in the conversations we've been happening, I find the questions you have in your own mind about getting your comics out there. An interesting aspect. Do you want to talk about that a little? What you feel about selling your comics versus having your comics out there in terms of people seeing them?
Yeah, this is something I don't have an answer to, but I'm very interested in, because I've been making comics for I think about 3.5 years, and I've never like worked with a publisher. I've never made anything bigger than the single comics that I put together sometimes in zines, and so it's been only self-published, and it made me think about the ways in which work gets out when it's self-published, and I was thinking, well, you also don't have much advertising for your work, so how do you do it? And at some point, I had made a large set of comics for a fair, and made the mistake, having never printed before, of getting it done offset, which didn't get the colors I wanted because I didn't know how to work with the color corrector. So it was the full book made very well, or the zine, but it was slightly off color, and I was like, I can't put this out there. But I have all of them. And so what I had started doing, I've actually, I think it's the first time I'm talking about it, but I had about, 300 of those, and I kind of just leave them in places. Or I went to give a talk on comics, and I gave it to that book out to all the kids who attended it. But at the same time, I want to sell those exact same books, and so the nice digital print I give to stores. But even with those, like when I'm giving it to someone who I respect or who I know or who I want to like say this is my work, I give that one for free. So it's an issue of money and it's an issue of earning. But I rationalized it because of being able to do this experiment, not knowing where it's going. I could rationalize it by saying, oh, I've earned it doing that gig, or like they paid me this for something else, so I can afford to like give these out for free. So it's just a question in my mind, because anyway, I realized this through self-publishing online, where there was no physical work, where anyway, when you put an image up on the internet, whether you're the author of it or not, it leaves you and it moves far away in ways which you have absolutely no control, and you can't control where it goes. So how does that go back to the physical thing, or like what happens when you try to play with that? So
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of thing to think about for most people who are working in this area. But so, I mean, yeah, I like this idea of Nishant's of actually just handing out the things that, or leaving it on bus stand things. So if you're walking around Panjim and sometime, 10 minutes left, all right. When you're walking around Panjim and you hear someone from the shadows saying, "Sst, have a comic," it's him doing his stuff. Okay. Priya, one of the differences between Nishant and you is that you worked on your own stuff and you work extensively collaborating with people. What are your pros and cons on these things? I'm sure I know that you enjoy both things. What do you like about one? What do you like about the other?
I like working on my own stuff more. But the nice thing actually with Indira, the thing is that we came with, two very different sets of, talents. I would not have been able to do the kind of research that Priya did on Indira. So she comes from an academic background, and she'd started researching her life, much earlier than the point that I came into the project. So in some ways it was nice that I could leave. So she was like my sutradhar. So she would call me every day and say, okay, I found this story, and this is what it was like, and how can we do this? So in that way, I could leave that part to her. But at the same time, at some point, we also traveled together. So with what she had, and so that I could have visual reference with a clear idea of what exactly we wanted. So in that sense, there's a lot of burden that is shared between the two of us. So I think it's nice, because then you concentrate on what you're good at, and it's kind of this. I mean, working on your own thing is always really nice, because it becomes so personal, and you put. again, there's in terms of vision, there's no need to ask anyone, okay, is this all right? Is this, and it's your own thing, so it makes a big difference.
These sessions, unfortunately, are too short, and I think we just start things and it feels like we have to wrap up. But you've got at least 2 collaborators in this room, right? You worked with Jerry as well on.
I'm honored. I'm so delighted when they said Priya.
Right. Okay, so we can't have a session here with you without touching upon a touchy subject. So everything that's happened around the pug. Yeah, the pug in the room. Yeah. I mean, this is especially, I mean, you know that during the opening ceremony, Dr. Trivedi was talking about this whole thing of, and even Priya Ramani was talking about this, the intolerance that is kind of, especially towards these, and how we need to speak out about it. And I think, I mean, I agree completely with that. And how has it been dealing with this situation? I know it's been a completely disruptive to many aspects of your life, your work, everything. But things are settling down a bit now.
You know what happened, guys?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, yeah, you're right. So for those who don't know, yeah, quickly. So Priya has recently illustrated a book called The Art of Tying a Pug, which essentially was a book about tying a pagdi, how a Sardar ties a pagdi, and a pun on the word and using the dog, the pug, and it led to a lot of people sort of, feeling that the religion had been insulted and needed to be avenged. And as it happens nowadays, everything becomes, like legal notices and threats of violence and death threats and all that sort of stuff. So it's been a few weeks, right? I mean, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? Last month, right. So how were things, how did you deal with it? How did you cope with the situation? And how are things now?
It's been the most bizarre 2 weeks, because I never thought, this was the last, I never thought a children's book would have people chasing after me, but that's what happens. And sometimes when I repeat the story, it just sounds very stupid coming out of my mouth, but it's true. The last two, it starts off by, I didn't take it too seriously, but then when, you start getting legal notices and multiple messages, saying that people are sort of running after you and, trying to sort of, the works, the typical kind of online threats. But the thing is, it's everyone's right to be offended, but you don't, violence of this kind is not, something that will solve anything. But I think it's also, it's the times we live in. There's, it's a reaction perhaps to this majoritarianism that we have, and everyone's feeling sort of insecure about their own belief systems. So it's all blowing over a bit, I think, right now. And the book is not being sold. Unfortunately, the book had to be withdrawn because there were people from the Gurdwara, committee in Chennai threatening to burn down the publishing house. And if you know children's book publishing, it's anyway a very, very small, very small part of the whole publishing industry in India. And if we lose that one publishing house, means at least, I think, maybe like 40% of children's picture books will vanish. So that's the, and of course, like in our country there are laws, but there's no assurance that these laws will protect the creators and the publishers. Yeah.
Okay, we are seeing our usual signs. So yes, we already have someone. Can one of you take the mic, please? Yeah. Oh, there is one. Okay.
Hi, Priya. Huge fan of your work, just like millions of children and parents are in India.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say, with a huge hug, bring back the pug. So I'm sure if and when the book comes back, it'll be a huge hit.
Yeah. There is one copy in Goa.
I wanted to, so sticking to the topic, how do you think this whole, this incident do you think it'll impact your other work?
Hope not,
Will you?
because actually the one thing that I was sort of, I was a bit upset about one thing where when, people call me and ask me, why did you do this book? Was it as important to do this book? Why didn't you kind of, didn't you think that something like this was coming along?
Intent.
Yeah,
They've missed it.
of course, they missed the intent. And also, I mean, you don't do, even children's books are literature, and literature is meant to push boundaries. Otherwise, you would just be kind of, sort of, you might as well be doing textbooks. So it's sort of, as important as any other form of writing or, yeah, I didn't complete that sentence, Annie.
Okay, more questions?
Just an intervention, guys. Your readers here, right? And what we look to from you is support. Okay? So when these things happen, it's not just Priya who's got to be brave. It's not just Karadi Tales who's got to be brave. It's all of us who've got to be brave. We've all got to write letters, stand up, complain, say, hey, this is not on. You can't be threatening people. You have to go trolling trolls, say, don't do this, don't talk like that. We've got to push back. We can't be like, we sit in bubbles sometimes, I think, and say to each other, Priya, be on your side, etc., etc. But we've got to turn our backs and say this to the outside world also. And it's small, but let's do it.
Yes, Paula? You have a question? Oh, damn. Yeah, I knew what you were going for. Okay, thank you, Nishant. Thank you, Priya. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It was fun, if short.